Welcome to another episode of Dangerous Dogma, and I'm excited to be joined with two others today. We're going to be thinking about what's happening in the news today, particularly thinking of the issues of religion and politics in the public square. And so you both have been on the program multiple times, but let's do a quick make sure we introduce ourselves and everyone knows who is helping us think about the news today. And so I'll go first. I am Brian Kaylor, the regular host of Dangerous Dogma, Baptist minister with a PhD in political communication, and president and editor-in-chief of Word&Way. Angela, and then Beau, how about you all remind us who you are?
Yeah, so I'm the resident Lutheran, I suppose, within Word&Way's sphere. Lutheran pastor for a little over a decade. Longtime journalist, began my career as a sports writer, and sharing the connection to the University of Missouri-Columbia, which is where I earned my degree and met my husband, Ben, who is not a pastor or a journalist.
I love that Mizzou connection. So I'm working on a doctorate there in public affairs, and my name is Beau Underwood. I am a Disciples of Christ pastor in Indianapolis. So we've got some religious diversity in this group. Though I'm a little nervous about the idea of asking three ministers to be brief in talking through all that's going on in the world right now, but we'll see how short we can keep these sermons.
Yeah, and so we want to talk about a few things, and we're just going to have a conversation about what's going on in the world. And I want to let people know we're gonna move on to a couple other segments in a moment. We'll be thinking about the government shutdown and about ICE, particularly clergy that have been protesting ICE. But let's start with thinking about elections. So we're recording this on Monday. It'll come out on Tuesday, November 4th, which is election day in a number of places. In Virginia and New Jersey, they're having gubernatorial and other elections. California voters are considering whether or not to respond to Texas's gerrymandering. But then there's also two really significant mayoral elections where religion has become part of the campaign in some negative ways. There's been attacks on the faith, the Muslim faith of mayoral candidates in New York City. I wrote about that last week at a public witness, and also on the Muslim faith of a mayoral candidate in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Angela, where you are, and you've written a couple of pieces at your newsletter about that election. So why don't you give us what's happening in that race? Because I think it's important to think about both of these races and how religion is being weaponized.
Yeah, it was funny. Before we moved back to Minneapolis in 2017, I was a pastor in Orange County, California, and I had a former parishioner of mine send me a message this morning, and he said, he sent me a clip of Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman who represents my neighborhood in Minneapolis, campaigning with Omar Fatah, who is one of the candidates for mayor here in Minneapolis, who is also a child of immigrants, Somali immigrants, and also a Muslim. And this parishioner said, oh no, watch out, Minneapolis. And I, kind of playing dumb a little bit, said, oh, why? What are you worried about? And he said, oh, Muslims are taking over. And I said, well, our population is currently 2% Muslim. So, got to worry a little more about the Lutherans and the Catholics still up here. And he said, oh, never mind. I was just taking a shot in the dark. But I think, that really speaks to, and I was grateful. I had the opportunity. I had two candidates for mayor here in Minneapolis approach me and ask if I would feature them on my newsletter. And I was grateful to be able to do that. One of whom is a pastor, Dwayne Davis, longtime pastor in the Congregational Church, recently led Plymouth congregation, which is one of the oldest congregations in Minneapolis. And then the other one is a former lawyer, entrepreneur, Jazz Hampton. They both approached me to be featured on my newsletter, and both of them actually, to their credit, mentioned these ethnic and religious motivated attacks on Omar Fatah, and just saying the extent to which they are unacceptable, and also the extent to which they feed into this larger narrative that I know we're going to talk about ICE later on in this conversation, of immigrants as other, as dangerous, and really attempting to rewrite America's identity when it comes to immigration. Although, of course, we know we have a long history also of xenophobia, of course, in this country.
Yeah, I think it's important to just also do the context on New York City, and then let's open this up and think about the attacks that are happening on likely really the front runners in both of these races. And so in New York City, we had the surprise election. At least it surprised a lot of establishment figures of Zoran Mamdani, who is also an immigrant and is Muslim. And he's leading in all of the polls. And so I guess it's not surprising, sadly, that we're seeing attacks on his faith really escalate in the past week. We've got Andrew Cuomo, who resigned as governor of New York in disgrace, has been really leaning in on making Islamophobic attacks. And others in New York have also been doing that as well, suggesting that he's a terrorist. Others have called him an animal. I mean, a lot of dehumanizing rhetoric and suggesting that he's unfit to serve as mayor because of his religion. And I think that really opens up like the point that the question we wanted to deal with here is, like, should it matter? Does it matter if the mayor of New York City or Minneapolis or, I mean, it's not happening anytime soon, but Indianapolis or Jefferson City? Like, does it matter if our mayors or other political leaders, public officials are not Christian? I mean, that seems to be the inference that some Christians are saying.
I just want to quickly, on Minneapolis, Fata really probably isn't the front runner. But what media has been trying to do is they're casting him like he is Mamdani because the Fry, our incumbents campaign, has decided he's better off if he's pitted against Fata. So it's really a different situation here in Minneapolis. But because there's all this attention being paid to Mamdani, I think that there's been this attempt to say, oh, Fata is also in this same camp, but really it's a more complicated picture here about who really is the front runner. Please, Beau.
I was going to say, I think with Mamdani, what's shocking in a way, though maybe not surprising, is that here you have New York City, the site of the horrific 9/11 terrorist attacks, and you could have this moment of, presumably electing the first Muslim American mayor as a celebration, right? This city that was attacked, and there had been so much Islamophobia as a result of those attacks, is now embracing a Muslim public leader as the next mayor and celebrating what that means in terms of pluralism in our society. And instead, of course, that the events of 9/11 are being used as a cudgel to, question his identity, his status as an American, his status as a New Yorker. I think we saw this before, right, in the attempts to, enshrine anti-Sharia law legislatively or at state constitutions. I mean, there's this long train of fear that Muslims are somehow different, their religion is different, their political allegiances aren't to, the United States, the Constitution, whatever the attacks are. That's really dangerous because of the way it makes them an other, and it makes them seem as like they're not American enough to be in public office. We've seen this certainly with the calls for the deportation of Representative Omar. So I think that we need to think really carefully about what we as Christian leaders are saying as a way of standing in solidarity with those who are from a different religious background in a nation where there's not supposed to be a religious test for public office. So, Brian, your question, no. There's no religious test for public office here. You can be a great mayor as a Christian, a Lutheran, an Episcopalian, an atheist, a Muslim, and you can be a terrible mayor as a Lutheran, a Christian, Muslim, and an atheist. Your quality as mayor has nothing to do with your religious identity, and yet we've somehow, think it does.
Yeah, I think that's what's really important here. I mean, the only religious reference in the original Constitution is Article 6, explicitly prohibiting religious tests for office, and which is one of the things that cuts against that whole idea that we were founded as a, quote, Christian nation, because that's not something you would do if you were trying to create a Christian nation. You would create a religious test for office that you have to be a Christian to serve, and some states did do that. They eventually have all been overturned and no longer allowed because of the U.S. Constitution. And I think that it makes sense too, like in a democracy. I mean, I don't check my pick my dentist or my plumber, based on their religious identity. And I'm looking for experience and competency, and in office I'm looking for morality. I'm looking for ethics in addition to competency and experience. And there's a lot of incompetent, inexperienced, and unethical Christian politicians.
Brian, don't be so idealistic. I just want somebody who's going to get the garbage picked up, right? That's all. Like mayor is a pretty boring job. Run a council meeting, make sure services.
Apologies to all the mayors out there.
Yeah, I'm not diminishing it. It's an important job, but the point is, religion has little to do with it. Yet this is so freighted with symbolism for people, and then when we get behind what is behind that symbolism, it starts to get pretty ugly pretty fast.
Well, I want to bring up the hypocrisy, too, of these attacks, primarily from the right, on immigrants and on Muslim politicians who are running as progressives, because I also read this morning that apparently the new leader of Syria, who's formerly a member of al-Qaeda, is going to be invited to the Trump White House. So we have situations where the Trump administration is embracing right-wing authoritarian Islamic leaders, many of whom, especially in the case of Saudi Arabia, practice extremely fundamentalist, extreme forms of Islam that are the kinds that are being said, oh, this is what Mamdani or somebody like Fatah or someone like Ilhan Omar is going to bring to America. So in reality, we have on one hand an embrace of this fundamentalist version of Islam that has threatened America in the past. And then we have this creation of saying that immigrants are bringing that kind of Islam to America when overwhelmingly instead, immigrants have practiced much more tolerant forms of religion and in some cases are fleeing that fundamentalist form of Islam in their home countries.
Yeah, and also, usually the loudest voices, I mean, as Beau mentioned, there's been politicians that have tried to ban Sharia law, and they're also usually wanting to actually impose Christian nationalism, right? So, like, that's the hypocrisy there, is it's not that they're against religion being forced on people. They want their religion forced on everyone else.
Well, and Angela, I think your point is really well taken, but I also think it reinforces that narrative, right? It's okay for these Muslim majority countries led by authoritarian rulers to do their thing because that's their thing over there, but over here we're Christian nationalists, right? And so we need to protect our homeland, right? To use this phrase that so many are using, that a lot of the government advertising is using, from quote them. At the same time, but they can go do what they want to do in their country as long as they don't bring it here. And that's, again, it's really scary and dangerous when you start thinking about the logic of it, but I think that's the logic behind that hypocrisy.
Yeah, and before we move on, I do want to also note that this religious test has been put on others, not just Muslims, and in fact, even some Republican politicians are facing some of the same problems as the Democratic politicians that we've talked about in New York and Minneapolis, particularly Ramaswamy, who ran for president, is now running for governor of Ohio, who's a Hindu, and he was at a Turning Point USA event recently and was pressed repeatedly about his religion, and people there were uncomfortable. A couple of them even said, well, hey, Charlie Kirk, talked about how we're a Christian nation, so how can we support you if you're not even a Christian? And so these religious tests are much broader than just, Islamophobia. There's other religious tests that are being put on candidates, and I think we're going to continue to see more of it beyond the elections this week.
And very much the idea that, progressive Christians are also not real Christians, too. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Yeah, we just had an election last year where we were told that the candidate who hadn't been to church in, now we're almost at 4-year mark, other than funerals and inaugurations, hasn't been to a church service on Sunday in 4 years. And then the candidate who was actually a member of a church, we were told that one was a Christian and the other one wasn't, right? So that attack on progressive Christians. Well, speaking of pivoting now to thinking about Trump, we have the government is shut down. As we're talking, I think we're tying the record. So when this comes out, unless there's a miracle in DC this evening, that it'll be the longest government shutdown in history, breaking the record from the first Trump administration. But I wanted to kick this to you first because you've been a minister in DC. I think it's important that we think about why does a government shutdown matter, particularly the impact that it has on people, because it doesn't really impact Congress. They're still getting paid even when the House hasn't met, over 90 out of the last 112 days or whatever. They've been on a paid vacation, but there's a lot of people that are being really impacted by this.
There are, but I think you could actually start with a premise that what we've tried to do is shield as many people as possible from the pain, right? So obviously planes are still flying even though air traffic controllers are not being paid, right? The military is getting paid, so there's not a political weapon of how we're funding our military through this. But obviously with the SNAP funding drying up here as we've entered into the second month of the shutdown, we're having tens of millions of Americans who might be, going without food because the government isn't open to provide the resources for it. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about whether or not the Trump administration is getting too cute with the law here. TLDR, they are. But I think what we're also seeing tested is this narrative that I've been aware of since I worked in D.C. back in the mid-2000s, right? Which is, we don't really need the government to do this, right? Churches and charities should be the ones providing this kind of help. They should be stepping in. And now we're seeing them scramble to have to do that. Here in Indianapolis, there's an attempt to raise $1 million fund to provide food for those who are insecure, just in the gap, right? This isn't going to be funding forever. It's just to fill in the gap. And there's stories being celebrated. There's this pastor who, again, I commend. I'm glad he's doing it. He's putting his money where his mouth is, but he's showing up at Kroger on Sunday mornings and handing out a gift card because he was once food insecure. And so if those who don't have SNAP, he wants to give them a $50 gift card. That's wonderful. That's generous. A $50 gift card doesn't replace somebody's SNAP's benefits, let alone a whole bunch of people's SNAP benefits. So I think we're going to see just how critical the government is here to SNAP or to addressing food insecurity in our country. And I want churches and other charities to be a part of, mending our social fabric, but we have to be honest about what their capacity really is, and we need to be honest about the impact the government has on people's lives. And hungry people shouldn't be the political football here, right? And I think the Trump administration has ways of funding this. They're being told that by the judge. They've done that themselves the last time there was a shutdown. We shouldn't be using the pressure of food insecurity to force politicians to the negotiating table. We just shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that another thing that comes to bear here is we see the impact of the American narrative on poverty and how it intersects with race and gender when you hear Trump and other Republican politicians talking about how they understand SNAP. And broadly, that their understanding of who's on SNAP is basically Black single mothers who are living in urban blue states. And so there's an assumption that, hey, we can cut these benefits and it's not going to be our voters. When the reality is, and I've served as a pastor in the rural Midwest, rural poverty is widespread. The state that has the largest amount of folks on, the largest percentage of folks on SNAP benefits is Alabama, which is a deep red state. And here in Minnesota, over half of SNAP recipients live outside the Twin Cities. So I do think that there's the potential for some of these consequences to cut back against one of Trump's major selling points, which I think the shutdown kind of feeds into, is saying, hey, government doesn't do anything. You don't really need government. And the fact that we kind of plug along during a shutdown, if you're not a government worker, of course, or you're not living in D.C. But I think there's the potential for some greater understanding. Now, that coming at the price of 1 out of every 5 kids in America who's suffering without SNAP benefits, that's not a good trade. And I'm, as to Beau's point, I'm glad to see churches, and I know my church, other churches in our area are stepping in, and this is a major reverberating effect. SNAP benefits not being spent in local businesses is a huge hit to local grocery stores, other local businesses. I just think we're heading into a deep economic collapse, and I think it's pre-calculated because people who are economically desperate are easier to control in an authoritarian government.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to highlight that. I mean, Beau, you mentioned this as well, the idea of the poor being used as a bargaining chip. I mean, the fact is, as 2 different judges said on Friday, the Trump administration was illegally not continuing to at least provide some funding for SNAP, and then noting that there were other ways that they were allowed to fund. And we can see just by what is getting funded over the past month while the government is shut down that if the Trump administration wants to fund something, they've been finding ways. I mean, they've torn down the East Wing, and I mean, right, and they're finding funding for that, and a Great Gatsby themed party over the weekend, which, I mean, talk about amazingly tone deaf as SNAP benefits were ending, to have a Great Gatsby party that Trump was a part of, and even the military pay. I mean, so there's been allegations that he's illegally moved some money, and he's been finding some ways to pay them, even though they were supposed to be more like the air traffic controllers and not getting paid. So when Trump wants to find money, he's been doing it. And so the fact that they've been trying to block SNAP is really significant. And I find it wild that they've almost been suggesting that, though, this will lead the Democrats to cave because Democrats don't want kids to go hungry, which is quite a self-own by the Republican Party to suggest that, oh, the other party will cave because they're the ones that don't want people to go hungry.
So I want to go back to something Angela said for a minute, because this is one of the questions that I'm thinking about. And Angela, I think you're right. I hadn't even thought at some level about the economic impact of food, SNAP benefits not being spent at grocery stores. But your point about Alabama is right, obviously spot on. So, like, what happens when Alabama grocery stores start to struggle, right? What happens when those stereotypes of who SNAP recipients are get blown up because it turns out there's a lot of red state voters hurting too? I mean, I hate this idea because it implies that the only people that matter to the president or representatives of their own voters, right? That they only see certain people as their constituents, but they've basically admitted as much. So what happens when some of these myths about SNAP start to become undermined by reality? Will we see a reaction, or is this something where the mythology is so strong that the myth can be perpetuated even when reality is inconvenient?
I think this is part of this American reckoning with some truths that, I personally have had a hard time reckoning with too. When we talk about 1 out of every 5 kids being on SNAP, that has not impacted Republican policymakers, because overwhelmingly the thought is, well, those aren't our kids. And we've seen this before in conversations about gun violence. How many times have you heard someone give a statistic about the number of kids impacted by gun violence? And then, there's a clip of Charlie Kirk saying, well, that doesn't matter because it's gang violence. Basically, it doesn't matter if it affects Black kids. So I think that the level of, who gets to count as an American who matters. And the Democratic Party has been part of this too, of depicting somehow that farmers are, and I love farmers, right? Again, look at my outfit. I'm, representing today. But the idea that there's certain people who deserve assistance and others who do not, I think is really at the heart of this conversation today. And as Christians, that's part of the idea of the gospel and grace, that there's not anyone who deserves grace and to be part of Jesus' kingdom more than anyone else. So this is a key time for religious leaders to be willing to engage in this conversation and to discuss it according to Jesus' teachings.
Because we have to be clear, the churches can't fill in the gap. No. We're seeing our churches are stepping up. Lots of churches are stepping up. But churches are not able to fill in the gap of what SNAP is providing right now.
But the through line here, to Angela's point, in all the stuff we're going to talk about today, right, when we get to our third topic too, is who really counts? Who really matters, right? And the answer is not everybody, despite, the constitutional protections and ideals of equality. Not everybody's equal in our society. And of course, that's not revelatory to any of us. But then again, for us as pastors, from a theological standpoint, if every one of these hungry kids is a child of God, right? If every immigrant is a child of God, if every candidate for office is a child of God, shouldn't that matter more than it does, at least within the church, than the rest of society? And yet it doesn't, right? This is just one of those messages I have struggled with as a pastor, because it's very clear that what we claim theologically in the abstract, we are not living out practically in how we embody the gospel in the world.
We have all these myths, right? We have a Congress that's disconnected because none of them are. We have a wealthy Congress compared to, we don't have a working Congress like we used to have, at the founding, and so we know who they're beholden to. They're wealthy, donors and so forth, and they're disconnected. And we have a prosperity theology that's also taken over and is pushing a lot of misconceptions. I don't know, perhaps you all have seen these as well, but there's a number of pastors out there that are defending the not paying SNAP benefits because they're quoting from Paul of, well, he who won't work, shouldn't eat. Which one does, takes that verse completely out of context, because it was really about people just, sitting around expecting the second coming to happen, but also misses the fact that there's a lot of people on SNAP that are literally working. They're even members of the U.S. military. But you got people that are working at Walmart. You got people that are working 2 jobs sometimes that are on SNAP, and that says something much more significant about a failure of our capitalistic system than it does about the government or about these individuals.
And I bet you a lot of these pastors, I put myself in this group, I have no clue who in my congregation is or isn't on SNAP. I'm probably about to find out, right? I've sent a communication to our church saying, if you need some help through this, please, let me know. We have some funds to do that. But a lot of these pastors don't realize that the people who are benefiting from SNAP are in their congregation, or they're their deacon's sister's cousin, right? I mean, like, these are not an other that we never interact with. These are, college students and working moms and, like you said, Brian, military people and people who work in our convenience stores. I mean, these are Americans, and a lot of them are working hard, but the mythology is really strong here.
Yeah.
Well, and the reality is too, I think, you two literally wrote the book on understanding how mainline Christianity paved the way to Christian nationalism. But I think mainline preaching in this sense has enabled this kind of rhetoric a lot of times, because pastors have imagined their congregations to be in the position of helper and not in need of being helped in so many cases. This is what I've heard almost exclusively in most Lutheran churches, is we put ourselves in the position of giving others charity. And when charity is discussed, when poverty is discussed, it's always someone else who needs our help, not understanding that this is us as well. And so it's really, again, this moment of reckoning for white American Christianity and our uncomfortable alliance with prosperity, with this idea of being, middle class or more wealthy. And it's certainly come about of a long line of teaching in the last number of years. I'll also say too, when I think about being a pastor, my favorite parts often about being a pastor and the most important lessons I've learned have been in interacting with two groups, with elderly folks and with kids. Neither of those people are working, and many of them are on SNAP benefits. And it reminds me of this rhetoric during COVID where it was like, well, we can let a few elderly people die because we need to keep the economy going. And it's this sense that, again, some people count more than others. And I just think that we really have to understand the value of elderly people and kids to all of our lives, regardless of people's economic input or output. And certainly I think this is also the end result of letting tech bros and their own amorality really set the tone for how we understand our country's policies. And there's certainly no space within AI or robots or algorithms for morality or for worth that can't be measured on a numerical basis.
We're definitely going to have to, at some future month, talk more about AI. But I want to make sure that we move to thinking about ICE, because that has been such a dramatic part of the news for months now, but really it seems like it's escalating over the last few weeks. We've seen protests across the country against militarized ICE officials or National Guard or state troopers that are helping defend ICE facilities. We've seen a number of peaceful protests where the militarized forces have started suddenly attacking people, beating them, arresting people who are peacefully praying or protesting there, even shooting multiple clergy now with pepper balls in ways that violate the protocol. There was a Presbyterian pastor in Chicago that was shot in the head with a pepper ball. There was a United Church of Christ minister who was sprayed with it looked like the pepper ball had exploded before it got to him in the face. There was a Baptist pastor over the weekend who was shot in the leg by a pepper ball in the Chicago area. All of them are peacefully praying and protesting. And so I think it's really important. I want us to think about just, not only what's happening with ICE, but also how we're seeing clergy at this moment, like really leading the way at the front lines and putting their bodies, on the line to speak out here.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so inspiring for me about this moment is as I read history and the history of the Vietnam War protests, the history of the civil rights protests, how clergy were front and center and how powerful their presence and their sacrifice was to the progress that was made, right? And so, perhaps we're seeing that here. I think it's still too early to tell, but it is inspiring when you see these stories, these images of the clergy being on the front lines of this. And I also want to point out, the clergy are the victims of this too, right? So just today, there's a story out about a Episcopal priest in Texas who was detained despite having a valid work permit, and we don't know all the details yet, but it seems like wrongly targeted and being and at risk of deportation. Meanwhile, that ministry is now going unintended, right? And so I don't want clergy to be the exception, but it does feel like every time a clergy person gets caught up in this web, that there's more of an outcry around them, and it draws attention to how draconian this all is. And I wrestle with that, right? We should have that outcry every time there's a construction worker or a nursing home aide caught up in this too, right? Because they do important work for our society too. But I do think having the clergy front and center, both on the front lines and as the people caught up in the web of it, it's really driving people's attention to the immorality of what's going on right now and how authoritarian it's gotten.
And we have the reality of persecution of Christians for exercising Christian principles up next to these false claims of Christian persecution for, minor things like, oh, someone told me happy holidays, or
Angela, there's a task force we could report this to.
Yeah, right.
We'll take some notes here. We've had this, and for so long in America, there's been this claim that Christian persecution is equivalent to not allowing Christians to discriminate against other groups, that's somehow persecution. I didn't have to make a wedding cake for a gay couple. I was forced to have other religions' observances as a part of my kids' schools. And now we have clergy being shot at in the streets by the government. So I think it's important to lift up that contrast. And I also think as a pastor, it's encouraging and inspiring. And I know also all of us have little kids. It's also a little bit scary, how do we each personally determine what our role is going to be in these times to come? And how do we balance the responsibility of being a prophetic clergy voice with the responsibility of being present for our kids and our families?
Yeah, and I think it's this idea of the myth of the Christian persecution that we hear so much from some conservative pastors and politicians, and then how they're not speaking up when we're literally seeing clear. I mean, we have video, we have photos, we're seeing this, and they're not speaking out. Speaker Mike Johnson has been asked now twice about the incident of the Presbyterian pastor being shot in the head while praying. It's on video. And he's refused to condemn it. He's acted like he has no idea what it is. He has refused to condemn it as a violation of religious liberty rights, right? And so, I mean, here's a guy who talks all the time about how he and other Christians are being persecuted, and then refuses to speak up. It seems to be condoning, actual targeting of, violence against a Christian minister. And I also think it's really important. I've talked to a couple of the pastors who have been at the front lines, and the previous episode of Dangerous Dogma was a conversation with the United Methodist pastor, Hannah Cardin, who was arrested violently on video outside of the ICE facility in the Chicago area. And what she and others have always highlighted is, see how they're treating us as members of the clergy in public while the cameras are rolling. And now think about what they're doing behind closed doors. And one of the things I've been so inspired by is not just that the clergy have been there on the front lines, but how much they constantly are pushing to say this isn't about us. It's about the people who are being mistreated by ICE. And we want to draw attention to the atrocities and the injustices that perhaps are happening that we can't always see. We know are happening, but perhaps we can't see them. They're happening behind closed doors. And that's where they continue to put that focus.
Well, and over half of mainline Christians voted for Trump in 2024. And the reality is much of when right-wing figures have addressed this, arrest of David Black in Chicago, they've called him a pastor with quotation marks. And so what I've been telling mainline audiences, many of whom are more politically conservative, is just be aware. If you go to Lutheran church, if you go to Presbyterian church, they don't think you're a legitimate Christian. And so if you think because you're a white Christian that you're not going to be targeted by this administration, this is a warning signal.
So again, if I'm positive, I'm sitting here going, okay, mainline leaders, Catholic leaders, even there's a lot of white evangelicals, right? Not the mega Christians, but, white evangelical leaders who are speaking out on this in red states. And so I can tell a story where this is a really powerful religious witness rising to meet this moment and challenging the state and the empire, what's going on. And it doesn't seem like it's enough, right? It doesn't seem like, except in isolated cases of winning individual releases here and there, it's not having any effect on the sort of systemic operations of the government in terms of these immigration enforcement. So will it matter, or are we, will it have a long-term effect as there's more of these episodes? Will it change hearts and minds and ultimately policy? Or are we going to just be, witnesses and protesters to the inevitable dislocation of so many of our neighbors?
I mean, I don't think it's having an impact on the administration. Like, I mean, Mike Johnson just dismisses it, and we've seen the Department of Homeland Security send out multiple propaganda videos using Bible verses while scenes of their officials violently hunting down and looking for immigrants, right? So they think they're on the side of justice and righteousness. So, while they're running around trying to kidnap people in the streets, they're also kidnapping Bible verses to justify their violence. So I don't think they're going to be impacted. But what I'm hoping can happen here is that this sparks something in the communities, in the mainline communities where the clergy are speaking up, and to the broader community, right? So there are clergy standing at the front line of these protests where a lot of the people at the protest are in the nuns, the NONESs, right? They've been tired of the institutional church, and now they're seeing clergy standing there and taking the hits. And so there's a witness here that I think is really important, and I think it might be planting some significant seeds in parts of our community that have our neighbors and our younger generations that have been tired of what they've generally seen from Christians.
Well, and the challenge here is the media environment. Like in the 60s and 70s, during civil rights protests, during Vietnam War protests, you had a national media that was willing and able to cover the protests in a front page way, and it was trusted. You had largely most Americans were reading this and viewing the same news sources. So now we have a national media that barely covered No King's protests. It was buried way in the back of the New York Times. The Washington Post has now become proudly a conservative editorial page. So that's the challenge. But at the same time, I do think there's also that opportunity of grassroots narrative spreading. I'm in a few moms groups with moms from Oak Park and Chicago, and it's really inspiring seeing everyday moms who are out there and being really brave on behalf of their neighbors and understanding what's going on. And I think you're going to see it in the grassroots narratives before you ever see it on the pages of the New York Times, which is different than it was in the 60s and 70s.
Well, before we wrap everything up, we want to kind of end on, this has been a pretty positive segment, at least, compared to the first two. But I also want us to end with just thinking about, all right, so there's not just stuff happening in the news. We aren't just sitting around watching C-SPAN all of the time. So what's something that you've consumed lately that you've been reading, or, a podcast you've been listening to, or something you've watched? Something that you wanted to lift up that you would encourage others to check out as well. Beau, do you want to start us off there?
Yeah, so I was formed intellectually at a time when there was all the debates about anti-evolution and intelligent design. And I just remember, high school, college, even in grad school, those being really pointed discussions within churches and sometimes within the academy. And so I was fascinated by this new book that came out called Designer Science, A History of Intelligent Design in America. It's out from NYU Press, came out in September by a scholar named C.W. Howell. And so I requested a review copy for the review I write every month for A Public Witness, and got in touch with the author a little bit. And what's fascinating me about the book, I haven't gotten all the way to the end, so I can't tell you if I buy the argument or not, though look for a future review and I'll give that away. His argument is not just that this movement kind of petered out and had this impact in this moment, but that this movement really bred a skepticism of science and institutions that we continue to feel the impact of, whether it's COVID or the January 6th protests over the election, that a lot of the skepticism towards our institutions can be traced to the anti-evolution movement and the skepticism it sowed towards science, public schools, etc. So I'm really fascinated to see how that thesis plays out in the book. I'm reading it with, again, a lot of hearkening back to, oh yeah, that's what that was when I was in my teenage years. And I'm really fascinated by it. So looking forward to that book, and that's what I've got on my nightstand right now.
Angela?
I'll do a book, a podcast, and a TV show. I recently rewatched Big Little Lies, and it was kind of a good palate cleanser because it came out in this moment of sort of Me Too and a little bit more of a surge of feminism and women feeling more confident to share their stories. So it was nice to return to that time for a moment. So Big Little Lies, HBO Max, and then I listened to a podcast called Unicorn Girl, and it's a podcast about a scammer, and part of the ways that she did her scam and made money off of it was working through conservative Christian organizations, as in the case of many scammers. But in this case, she ran part of her scam through MOPS, which is Moms of Preschoolers. So really interesting, entertaining podcast, and you get to see a scammer go down, which is always a good feeling. And then finally, I finished the book. I've been reading a series of books on Israel and Palestine, and I read A Tale of Love and Darkness by Amos Oz, which was written about his childhood in the late 40s, in the time of the forming of the State of Israel. And it gave me a lot of insight into the beginnings of the Zionist movement in Israel, the kibbutz movement in Israel, and really helped me to understand a little bit deeper what's currently happening in Gaza, in Israel, and in Palestine.
So I've been watching the YouTube series The Promised Land. I don't know if you all have seen that. It is basically, it's a mockumentary style television show like The Office. Only it's about Moses leading the Israelites through the wilderness. And it's free to, anyone can watch it on YouTube. They dropped one episode last year as kind of a proof of concept, raise a bunch of money. There's another, I think, 5 episodes out, and it's hilarious on the one. First of all, it's got some great humor in there. Multiple characters are doing the interviews with the camera one-on-one, or the deadpan look, when they're annoyed or something while someone else is talking. It's also, it's surprisingly accurate in a lot of ways. It deals with some of the lesser known, I think, wilderness stories, and get some of the kind of, there's obviously some things they make up just for comedic effect, but some of the key aspects it's really moving through in some really interesting ways, and it's something we've enjoyed watching, as a family, and so it's a lot of fun. I encourage people to check it out as a very entertaining way to, sneakily learn a little bit about the Exodus story that we don't necessarily, always cover as well. Well, Beau and Angela, this has been a lot of fun. I'm glad we were able to solve all the world's problems in 40 minutes, and I'm sure some other problems will erupt. So we'll turn next month and try it again. But glad to have both of you here as conversation partners on this episode of Dangerous Dogma.
Thanks for the conversation. Thanks everybody out there who's listening. Let's do it again next month.